You think Europe replaced Russian gas with a global LNG market, a fungible commodity, cargoes that follow price signals across oceans, a few rough winters, then a stable new normal. That story is borrowed from oil. It does not describe LNG. The molecules are abundant, the hulls are not. About 700 specialized cryogenic carriers move every drop of seaborne gas on Earth. 90% of them are built in 4 shipyards. Almost everyone pays a royalty to a single French company most people have never heard of, and one country, Qatar, quietly pre-booked over 100 of them before anyone else woke up. The post-2022 European energy story does not survive contact with the order books. The LNG market is not a market in the sense most viewers picture. It is a fleet-constrained delivery system where 4 Asian shipyards and 1 French containment licensor decide who gets gas, when, and at what price. Europe did not replace pipelines with a global commodity. It replaced them with a queue. The queue is full until the late 2020s. The slots in the queue have been bought by buyers who saw what was coming, and the buyers who showed up later are paying spot rates that crossed $400,000 per day in winter 2022. The persistent price gap between Europe and Asia since then is not a weather story. It is the fingerprint of a shipping constraint that price signals cannot solve. Europe didn't replace Russian gas with a global market. It replaced it with a queue for ships that don't exist yet. The story you were told after 2022 went like this. Pipelines were vulnerable. LNG is a global commodity. Tankers move it where prices call. Europe paid the premium and the market cleared. Almost none of that is how LNG actually works. There are roughly 700 LNG carriers on the planet. Almost every one is locked into a charter contract running 10 to 20 years. The spot fleet, the part that can actually respond to a price signal, is a thin sliver, and the ships that don't exist yet, the ones Europe is implicitly counting on for the late 2020s, are sitting in shipyard order books that are already full, which means the buyers who got there first own the decade. The intuitive read is that LNG behaves like oil. The operational reality is that it does not. Crude oil moves on roughly 800 very large crude carriers and more than 7,000 smaller tankers, built in dozens of yards across multiple countries, broadly interchangeable. When prices in one basin rise, idle hulls or hulls about to go idle redirect, and the spread closes within weeks because there is always a tanker between contracts somewhere. LNG is moved by around 700 specialized cryogenic carriers. Each one is a floating thermos that keeps methane at -162 degrees Celsius for the entire voyage. They are built in a handful of yards. Most are tied up in long-term charters before they ever leave the dock. Spot capacity in this market is what is left over after the long-term contracts have taken their pick. In a tight year, that residue produces charter rates above $400,000 a day because there are no idle hulls to compete those rates down. The cost of this section is the analogy. You walked in thinking LNG was a commodity with a shipping layer. You leave knowing LNG is a shipping system with a commodity layer. The hulls come first. In winter 2022, the spot rate to charter a single LNG carrier crossed $400,000 per day. Industry brokers described the market as effectively sold out. Multi-winter charters were being fixed at elevated rates. Buyers who showed up late did not negotiate. They waited. A market does not price a ship at $400,000 a day because shipping is expensive. It prices a ship that way because no other ship is available. Almost every large LNG carrier on Earth is built in 4 shipyards, 3 in Korea, 1 in China. They're full until 2028. The 3 Korean yards are HD Hyundai, Samsung Heavy Industries, and Hanwha Ocean. The Chinese yard is Hudong Zhonghua. Together, those 4 yards build roughly 90% of all large LNG carriers above 174,000 cubic meters. Lead times that used to run 36 to 48 months have stretched to 48 to 60 months. Slot availability at the top Korean yards is gone until the late 2020s. New build prices for a standard 174,000 cubic meter carrier rose from about $190 million in 2020 to around $260 million by 2024. That is the price signal of an oligopoly running running at capacity, not a competitive market that scales with demand. At the same time, older steam turbine carriers are being scrapped or converted into floating storage units. They have high boil-off rates and poor fuel economics, and they are losing out to newer two-stroke designs. Each retired steam turbine subtracts one ship from the spot pool, while each new build takes 4 to 5 years to arrive. The gross fleet number rises, the trading fleet rises more slowly, and the spot fleet barely rises at all. The intuitive read is that shipping is abundant background infrastructure that scales when demand calls. The operational reality is that shipping is the foreground constraint, already running hot, with retirements offsetting part of every new build and a 4-year delay between order and delivery. The cost of this section is the assumption of slack. You walked in thinking the fleet had headroom. You leave knowing the fleet is the binding constraint, and it has been binding since 2022. The next reassurance is that supply will respond. If the world needs more LNG carriers, the world will build more LNG carriers. That is what markets do. Markets do that when supply is competitive. LNG shipbuilding is not. 90% of large LNG carrier production is concentrated in 4 yards, 3 in South Korea, 1 in China. There is no European LNG carrier yard at scale. Japanese yards have largely exited the segment. Indian and Vietnamese yards do not build at this specification. The United States has not built a large LNG carrier in decades. If LNG were really fungible, Europe and Asia prices would converge. They don't. There aren't enough ships to make them. The TTF benchmark in Europe and the JKM benchmark in Northeast Asia have shown a persistent gap since 2022. Sometimes Europe trades at a premium, sometimes Asia does. In a fungible market, that gap should close almost immediately. Cargoes should redirect. Ships should arbitrage the spread. They cannot. Most carriers are committed to long-term contracts. Spot capacity is thin. Voyage times are long. Each diverted cargo means a ship out of position for weeks afterward. The persistent spread is not a regional weather story. It is the signature of a shipping constraint. 2 basins that price says should be one market, kept separate by the physical layer that says they cannot be. When one of the 4 yards fills up, the other 3 quote longer lead times and higher prices. There is no 5th yard waiting in the wings. New entrants in China, Jiangnan and Dalian COSCO, are coming up the curve, but they do not yet build at the same throughput as the established players, and they depend on technology licenses that themselves are constrained, which is the next problem. The intuitive read is that shipbuilding is a competitive global manufacturing industry. The operational reality is that LNG carrier construction is a 4-yard oligopoly with a multi-year queue, and that queue itself has become a strategic asset that strategic buyers have already taken. The cost of this section is the belief that supply scales. You walked in trusting that capital would find a yard. You leave knowing the yards are full, the queue has owners, and the owners moved before you did. There is a layer above the yards. Every LNG carrier built today pays a toll to one French company most people have never heard of. The company is GTT, Gaz Transport et Technigaz, listed in Paris. They do not build ships. They do not own ships. They license the cargo containment system that goes inside the ship. Almost every modern large LNG carrier uses one of 2 GTT membrane designs, the NO96 system or the Mark III system. The Korean yards license the technology from GTT. The Chinese yards license the technology from GTT. New entrants like Jiangnan and Dalian COSCO license it too. GTT earns royalties on each vessel built under its design, on the order of several million euros per hull. The Moss-type spherical containment system, the older alternative with the visible domes on deck, survives in niche segments, but has been crowded out by the membrane design's better volumetric efficiency. If you want to build an LNG carrier at scale, you talk to GTT. There is no second supplier. The bottleneck is not steel. It is intellectual property held by one French firm. If you value calm, in-depth explanations like this, subscribe to Beneath Systems for more videos that uncover the systems shaping our world. The intuitive read is that shipbuilding bottlenecks are physical: steel, labor, dock space, capital. The operational reality is that the binding constraint sits one layer above all of that in licensed cargo containment design held by a single French firm. This changes what new entry looks like. A country that wants to break the 4-yard oligopoly cannot simply build a dock. It needs the license to put a working cargo system inside the hull. If GTT licensing tightens or or if technology transfer becomes a geopolitical pressure point, the entire global LNG carrier supply curve tightens with it, because the 4 existing yards and any future entrants all depend on the same Paris-based licensor. The cost of this section is the picture of the supply chain. You walked in thinking the chain ended at the shipyard. You leave knowing the shipyard is itself a downstream node, and every LNG carrier afloat is paying a toll to a company most viewers cannot name. While the rest of the energy world was watching pipeline politics, somebody was reading the order books. In winter 2022, hiring an LNG carrier cost more than $400,000 a day. The market wasn't expensive, it was sold out. That price was not a market clearing price in the normal sense. There were not enough ships at any price. The buyers who paid $400,000 a day got carriers. The buyers who came late did not. They waited for the next winter, or they did not get cargoes at all. Now ask who anticipated this, who saw the bottleneck coming and moved before everyone else. The answer is one country, and what they did to the order books in Korea and China between 2020 and 2024 quietly closed the late 2020s to almost everyone else. Qatar quietly bought the next decade of LNG shipping. Over 100 carriers pre-booked before anyone else moved. Between 2020 and 2024, Qatar Energy placed orders or reservation agreements for somewhere between 104 and 120 large LNG carriers at Korean and Chinese yards. The deals were structured to reserve slots in advance, ahead of Qatar's North Field expansion. The effect was not just to secure Qatar's own future fleet, it was to crowd out other buyers, to close large portions of yard capacity to anyone else who showed up later. US Gulf liquefaction projects coming online in the late 2020s now face a tighter shipping market than their nameplate economics assumed when they reached final investment decision. Qatar did not buy ships. Qatar bought the queue by the time other buyers tried to book slots for 2027 and 2028 deliveries. The slots were gone. The intuitive read is that shipyard capacity is allocated by an open market clearing on price. The operational reality is that it was allocated to whoever moved first and biggest, and Qatar moved first and biggest by a margin nobody else has come close to matching. A sovereign with patience, scale, and a forward view of the North Field expansion converted yard capacity into a strategic asset before it was priced as one. The cost of this section is the assumption of fair access. You walked in believing capital and willingness to pay would secure hulls. You leave knowing the hulls were already booked, and the booker was a sovereign that read the constraint before it was a constraint. Even with a hull, the geography decides whether it can do its job. When Panama dried up, LNG carriers had to sail around Africa, 10 extra days each way. The fleet didn't shrink, it just got slower, which is the same thing. A US Gulf to Northeast Asia voyage through the Panama Canal takes about 20 to 25 days. In 2023 and 2024, drought conditions on the Panama Canal forced reduced transits. LNG carriers, which do not have priority booking, were among the first cargoes to lose their slots. Many rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope. The same voyage stretched to 35 or 40 days. Each extra day of voyage time removes round trips per year. A ship that used to do 10 round trips now does 7 or 8. The fleet number on paper does not change. The fleet capacity in practice falls by 20 to 30% on those routes. Add Suez disruptions, add Bab el Mandeb security threats from 2023 onward. Stack the choke points together, and the working fleet shrinks again, even as the order books say it grew. Most energy analysts watch the molecules. The constraint is the hulls. That's where this market actually clears. The molecules are abundant. The United States has built out liquefaction capacity at extraordinary speed. Qatar's North Field expansion will add tens of millions of tons per year. Australia is mature production. Mozambique and other African projects are coming. None of that matters at the price level if there are no ships to move it. A market with abundant supply and constrained delivery does not behave like a market with scarce supply and abundant delivery. The price signals look similar from a distance. Up close, they describe entirely different constraints. The first market clears when more producers come online. The second market clears when more hulls come online. And hulls come online 4 to 5 years after you order them, in yards already full. If you are watching the molecules, you are watching the wrong layer. The clearing happens one floor down. Russia's Yamal Arctic project illustrates the rigidity from the other direction. Its specialized ice-class Arc 7 carriers are purpose-built for one route. They cannot be redeployed to clear a US Gulf to Asia spread because they are not interchangeable with the standard fleet. fact, specialization is the system. Substitutability is the exception. The intuitive read is that voyage routes are execution detail handled by shipping operators. The operational reality is that voyage routes are fleet capacity. A canal at reduced flow is a fleet at reduced size. A strait under attack is a fleet under attack. The fleet on paper is not the fleet in practice. The cost of this section is the assumption that shipping is a logistics layer. You walked in thinking routes were details. You leave knowing routes are the capacity itself, and the capacity is exposed at 3 different choke points simultaneously. Stack the layers. About 700 LNG carriers exist. Most are locked into long charters. Spot capacity is a sliver. Roughly 90% of the fleet is built in 4 yards, 3 Korean and 1 Chinese, with order books full into the late 2020s. New build prices have risen from $190 million to $260 million in 4 years. Almost every hull built uses cargo containment licensed by one French company, GTT. Qatar pre-booked over 100 carriers between 2020 and 2024. Spot rates crossed $400,000 a day in winter 2022, and the voyages that connect basins run through Panama, Suez, and Bab el Mandeb, all of which have constrained or threatened to constrain in the last 3 years. Replacing a pipeline with a market sounds like freedom. It isn't. You just swap one dependency for another, and the new one runs through Asian shipyards and tropical canals. The political story said Europe traded a vulnerable supplier for a flexible market. The operational story is different. Europe traded a small number of fixed land routes for a constrained fleet of seaborne carriers passing through 3 vulnerable choke points supplied by a market where Qatar has cornered late 2020s. Capacity and yards in 2 countries set the pace of new entry. Energy security is not a binary. It is a question of which exposures you have chosen to hold. Pipelines exposed Europe to a small number of suppliers. LNG exposed Europe to a small number of shipyards, a single licensor, a sovereign forward buyer, and a handful of canals. The exposures are not the same, but they are not absent either. A market is not freedom. A market is a different geometry of dependence. The persistent TTF-JKM spread since 2022 is not a regional demand story. It is a structural signal. 2 basins that price says should be one market, kept apart by the fact that no ship is free to close the gap in numbers large enough to clear the gap, on routes short enough to clear it inside 1 season. The next LNG winter price spike will not be about molecules. It will be about hulls that do not exist, in yards that are already full, on routes through canals that may not have water. Europe walked away from Russian pipelines and walked into a market run by Korean shipyards, a French licensor, and Qatari forward planning. That isn't independence. It's a different kind of dependence. When the pipelines closed, the political class declared a victory. Energy independence, a flexible global market, diversification. What actually happened is that the dependence moved from Gazprom and a few pipeline corridors to a fleet of 700 specialized carriers, 4 shipyards in 2 countries, 1 French licensor, and a sovereign in Doha that saw the bottleneck before anyone else and bought the queue. This new geometry has its own failure modes, and the next price shock will come from the layer almost nobody is watching. The molecules are abundant. The hulls are not. The clearing happens at the hull layer, in shipyards most viewers cannot name, under licenses they have never heard of, on routes through canals that may or may not have water. Europe did not gain a global market. It gained a different kind of dependence, with different gatekeepers and different choke points. The pipelines ran east. The new dependencies run through Geoje, Ulsan, Shanghai, and Paris. The map changed. The fact of the map did not. If this video gave you a clearer way to understand the world beneath the surface, subscribe to Beneath Systems for more deep dives every week.